The chamber stretched endlessly upward, its crystalline walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to breathe with the collective heartbeat of 1,000 species. Ambassador Maria Santos stood at the center of the vast space, her simple gray diplomatic uniform looking almost primitive against the backdrop of floating energy beings, crystalline entities that sang in harmonic frequencies, and creatures of pure thought encased in shimmering containment fields. The Galactic Council had assembled in full session for the first time in 3 centuries. Representatives from every corner of the galaxy floated, stood or simply existed in their designated sectors, their attention focused on the 3 humans who sat at a modest metal table that seemed laughably inadequate in this cathedral of alien majesty. High Chancellor Vexithera, a being of condensed starlight contained within geometric patterns of pure mathematics, spoke first. Its voice resonated through every translation matrix simultaneously, reaching every inhabited world in the galaxy. The species designation human stands accused of violating the fundamental laws of galactic order, the Chancellor announced. Aggressive territorial expansion beyond assigned sectors, interference with pre-contact civilizations, introduction of destabilizing ideologies to peaceful species. The punishment for these crimes is absolute extinction. Maria remained perfectly still as the accusations echoed through the chamber. Beside her, General Tom Rodriguez and Dr. Alex Wang maintained the same calm composure that had baffled alien observers for months. Earth's first diplomatic mission to the Galactic Council was supposed to have been a formal introduction, a chance to petition for membership in the vast interstellar community that had governed the galaxy for 50,000 years. Instead, it had become a trial. The evidence against humanity was overwhelming and undeniable. Human colonies had indeed spread beyond their assigned borders. Human traders had made contact with dozens of species that the Council had classified as developing and therefore off-limits. Most damning of all, humans had introduced concepts that the Council found deeply disturbing. Individual freedom, democratic governance, and the radical notion that any species could choose its own destiny. The Galactic Council maintains order through careful balance, continued Vexithera. Each species occupies its designated role in the greater harmony. The builders construct, the traders commerce, the guardians protect, the thinkers contemplate. This system has brought peace for millennia. Around the chamber, representatives nodded or expressed agreement in their various ways. The crystalline resonance chimed in perfect harmony. The gas-form drifters shifted their molecular patterns in synchronized approval. The ancient archive keepers, being so old they predated most stars, hummed with satisfaction at this preservation of cosmic order. Humans, Vexithara's voice carried a note of genuine puzzlement, refuse to accept their designated role. They insist on attempting all functions simultaneously. They build, trade, guard, and think without regard for cosmic harmony. Worse, they encourage other species to abandon their proper roles. Maria finally stood, her movement causing a ripple of attention throughout the vast chamber. When she spoke, her voice was calm but carried clearly to every corner of the space. Your Honor, before this council passes its sentence, I formally request the right of final testimony as granted under Article 7 of the Galactic Compact. A murmur of surprise swept through the assembled representatives. The right of final testimony was an ancient provision, rarely invoked because most species facing extinction were either too primitive to know of its existence or too panicked to remember it. Vexithara's geometric form shifted into what might have been amusement. You surprise us, human. Most condemned species use their final moments to plead for mercy or rage against their fate. Very well, you may speak. The galaxy will hear humanity's last words before your homeworld is sterilized and your colonies redistributed to more worthy species. Maria reached into her jacket and withdrew a small device that looked deceptively simple, a raw, flat black rectangle no larger than her palm. She placed it on the metal table where every sensor in the chamber could examine it. Before we proceed with that sentence, Maria said, her tone remaining conversational, I think there are a few things about humanity that the Council should understand. She pressed a single button on the device. Instantly, every display screen in the chamber, and indeed, every communication device across the galaxy showed the same image. A real-time star map displaying the current positions of all Galactic Council fleets, defense stations, and military installations. The reaction was immediate. Representatives throughout the chamber began frantically contacting their homeworlds as the impossible became visible. The star map was updating in real time, showing massive shapes appearing near every major population center, resource hub, and strategic location across the galaxy. Ships, enormous vessels that dwarfed even the Council's most massive dreadnoughts. Ships that appeared to be made not of metal or energy, but of something organic, alive. Ships that had somehow materialized without triggering a single detection system. "What is this?" Vexithara demanded, its mathematical form flickering with what could only be shock. General Rodriguez stood slowly, his weathered face carrying the hint of a smile. "This, Your Honor, is what happens when the galaxy declares war on a species that has spent its entire existence preparing for conflicts they couldn't even imagine." The chamber erupted into chaos as representatives received reports from across the galaxy. Human vessels were appearing everywhere, but they weren't attacking. They were simply waiting. Silent. Patient. Impossible. Dr. Wang finally spoke, his voice cutting through the pandemonium with quiet authority. "The Council operates under the assumption that technological advancement follows predictable patterns. You've cataloged every possible form of faster-than-light travel, every conceivable weapons system, every known method of interstellar construction. Your detection networks monitor for all of these things." The star map shifted again, zooming in to show the interior of one of the human vessels. What the Council saw defied every principle of engineering they understood. The ship wasn't built, it was grown. Living corridors pulsed with biological rhythms. Crew members moved through spaces that seemed to reshape themselves as needed. "What you're seeing," Dr. Wang continued, "are the Wanderers, creatures that evolved in the dark spaces between galaxies, beings older than your Council, older than most of your civilizations. They've been lonely for a very long time." Maria stepped forward, her device now projecting a three-dimensional display that filled the center of the chamber. It showed not just the current position of the human fleet, but their movements over the past year. They hadn't traveled through normal space at all. They had moved through dimensions the Council didn't even know existed. "Humans have a particular talent," Maria explained, as the chamber fell into stunned silence. "We make friends with things that others consider impossible to befriend. We've been talking to the Wanderers for almost 50 years now, learning from them, growing with them." The implications hit the Council like a physical blow. These weren't ships at all, they were living beings, massive spacefaring creatures that humanity had somehow not just contacted, but formed genuine partnerships with. Creatures that could slip between dimensions, that fed on exotic matter, that could survive in the void between galaxies. High Chancellor Vexithara's form dimmed noticeably. "This is unprecedented. No species has ever achieved genuine symbiosis with void fauna. The mathematical probability is irrelevant," Maria interrupted gently. "Mathematics describes what has happened. It doesn't limit what can happen. And right now what's happening is that humanity is requesting a formal renegotiation of the charges against us." The star map expanded again, showing not just the human vessels but the space around them. Other ships were appearing, our vessels from dozens of species that the Council had written off as minor players in galactic politics. Species that had formed alliances with humanity, that had embraced human concepts of cooperation and mutual growth. "The galaxy declared war on humanity," Maria said, her voice now carrying to every corner of the vast chamber and every world beyond it. "But I think you'll find that humanity has a very different understanding of what war actually means." As if summoned by her words, reports began flooding in from across the galaxy. The human ships weren't conquering worlds around, they were healing them. Ancient territorial disputes were being resolved. Dying ecosystems were being restored. Stagnant technologies were advancing at unprecedented rates. The Council chamber fell into absolute silence as the full scope of humanity's invasion became clear. This wasn't an act of war, it was an act of renewal. And at the center of it all, 3 humans sat calmly at their simple metal table, waiting for the galaxy to understand that the war had already ended before it began. The question now was not whether humanity would survive, but whether the galaxy was ready to learn what it meant to truly live again. Panic swept through the Galactic Council chamber like wildfire, as representatives frantically attempted to contact their homeworlds. The impossible star map floating above Maria Santos continued its relentless update, showing human vessels appearing in sectors that should have been impenetrable, near worlds that had been considered absolutely secure. The crystalline resonant, named Shard Echo Kelvana, vibrated at frequencies approaching ultrasonic as she received reports from her people. Impossible. Our harmonic detection grids should have sensed any approach weeks in advance. Nothing organic can survive transition through dimensional barriers without EU. Without proper preparation, yes, Dr. Alex Wang interrupted calmly. That's been the fundamental assumption limiting galactic expansion for millennia. Your species have all mastered space travel within the known dimensional framework, but you've never considered that the framework itself might be incomplete. General Tom Rodriguez accessed a secondary display on Maria's device, and the chamber's screens shifted to show close-up images of the human vessels. What they revealed sent ripples of shock through the assembled representatives. The ships were breathing, massive organic forms that stretched for kilometers, their hulls rippling with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed in slow, hypnotic rhythms. They weren't constructed vessels at all, but living creatures of unimaginable size and apparent intelligence. Port-like openings along their flanks dilated and contracted like gills, while tendril-like appendages tasted the stellar winds around them. "Meet the Wanderers," General Rodriguez said, his voice carrying decades of military authority. "They're not ships, Chancellor. They're partners." High Chancellor Vexithera's mathematical form flickered rapidly, its geometric patterns struggling to process this violation of everything the Council understood about the universe. "Partners? You claim to have formed genuine symbiotic relationships with void fauna. The xenobiology alone makes this impossible. The communication barriers are only barriers if you assume communication must follow familiar patterns," Maria interjected. She gestured toward the display, which now showed the interior of one of the massive creatures. Instead of mechanical corridors and artificial life support systems, the images revealed vast organic chambers where humans lived and worked alongside their hosts. The walls weren't walls at all, but living tissue that glowed with soft, warm light. Humans moved through spaces that seemed to respond to their presence, passages widening or narrowing as needed, gravity adjusting automatically for comfort. Most remarkably, the humans appeared to be communicating directly with their environment through some form of biological interface. "The Wanderers have been traveling between galaxies for millions of years," Dr. Wang explained. "They're ancient beyond your comprehension, and they've been profoundly lonely. They remember when the universe was young and full of species that reached across the void just to see what was there." The display shifted again, showing archived footage from humanity's first contact with the creatures. It began 50 years earlier, when human deep space explorers had detected anomalous readings in the space between star systems. Instead of reporting the discovery to authorities or attempting to study the phenomena from a safe distance, a small team of humans had done something characteristically reckless. They had gone to investigate personally. What they found changed everything. The Wanderer they encountered, or a relatively small specimen, only a few hundred meters long, had been drifting alone in the cosmic void for centuries. It was dying, slowly starving in the empty space between stars, its bioluminescent patterns dim and irregular. The human explorers, led by a xenobiologist named Captain Lisa Chen, made a decision that their own species later called either brilliant or insane. They tried to help. Captain Chen and her team spent 3 months learning to communicate with their first Wanderer, Maria continued, not through radio signals or mathematical proofs, but through biochemical exchange. They literally shared their blood, their breath, their cellular material. They taught the creature about human curiosity, human compassion, human dreams of exploration. The archival footage showed the gradual transformation as the dying Wanderer regained its vitality. Its bioluminescent patterns brightened and stabilized. More importantly, it began to respond to human presence with something that could only be described as joy. In return, Dr. Wang added, the Wanderer taught humanity about the deep currents that flow between galaxies, about dimensions that fold space and time, about the ancient songs that call across the void to anyone willing to listen. Shard Echo Kelvana's crystalline form had shifted to a deep blue color that indicated profound disturbance. You're claiming that humans achieved biological integration with entities that we barely recognize as life forms. The physiological incompatibilities alone are overcome by genuine care, General Rodriguez said simply. The Wanderers don't just carry us through space. They've become our friends. Our family. They share our dreams because we've learned to share theirs. The display now showed the current state of human wanderer cooperation. Entire colonies existed within the creatures' vast bodies, not as parasites but as cherished passengers. Human children played in organic playgrounds that grew themselves according to the youngsters' imagination. Human scientists worked in laboratories, where the walls themselves served as research partners, capable of analyzing molecular structures through direct biological sensing. Most remarkably, the humans and Wanderers had together developed technologies that the Galactic Council had never imagined. Organic computers that thought in living patterns, transportation systems that moved through biological portals rather than mechanical engines, weapons that could pacify rather than destroy, designed by creatures who had seen enough war across the eons to value peace above conquest. This is why your detection systems never saw us coming, Maria explained. We didn't travel through normal space. We didn't use any technology you could recognize. We simply asked our friends to take us where we needed to go, and they carried us through dimensions that your physics consider theoretical. The scope of human expansion became clear as the star map expanded to show the full extent of their presence. They weren't just near major worlds, they were everywhere. Hidden colonies and asteroid belts that turned out to be sleeping wanderers, research stations in deep space that existed inside creatures the size of small moons, trade networks that operated through biological portals spanning impossible distances. High Chancellor Vexithera's form had dimmed to barely visible levels. How long? It asked quietly. How long have you been preparing this? Deployment? 50 years, General Rodriguez replied. Ever since the Council first contacted Earth and informed us of our proper place in galactic society. We realized immediately that the galaxy's idea of order and humanity's nature were fundamentally incompatible. So you chose war, accused Shardeko Kelvana. No, Maria said firmly. We chose friendship. We chose growth. We chose to find partners who shared our belief that the universe is vast enough for everyone to become more than they were. As if summoned by her words, new signals began reaching the chamber. Reports from across the galaxy of human activity that defied every expectation. On the crystalline worlds of the resonance, human engineers were working alongside native harmonists to repair frequency generators that had been failing for decades. In the gas clouds of the drifter territories, human doctors were developing new treatments for molecular degradation syndromes that had plagued the species for generations. You're not conquering, Vexthera observed, its voice filled with something approaching wonder. You're helping. We're doing what humans do, Dr. Wang said with a slight smile. We see problems that need solving and we solve them. We see people who need help and we help them. We see friends who need friends and we become friends. The chamber fell silent as the full implications became clear. Humanity hadn't declared war on the galaxy. They had declared partnership. They had spent 50 years not building weapons of mass destruction, but cultivating relationships of mass creation. And at the center of it all, swimming through the void between galaxies, ancient creatures that had been alone for eons finally had companions who understood their longing for connection. The war the Council had declared was already over. The question now was whether the galaxy was ready to accept the friendship humanity offered in return. What do you want from us? Vexthara asked finally. Maria's smile was gentle but determined. We want you to remember what it feels like to dream of something impossible, and then make it real. We want you to remember what you've forgotten in all your millennia of perfect order. She paused, letting her words settle through the vast chamber. We want you to remember how to grow. While chaos continued to unfold in the Galactic Council chamber, the true scope of humanity's invasion was becoming clear across the galaxy. On 1,000 worlds, in space stations orbiting ancient stars, and in colonies floating in the cosmic void, human ambassadors were conducting the strangest war in galactic history. A war fought with medicine, engineering, and children's laughter. On the crystalline world of Harmonic Prime, human engineer David Kim stood before the planet's governing crystal matrix, a formation of living minerals that had ruled the resonant species for 10,000 years. The matrix sang in frequencies that could shatter mountains, but today its harmony was broken, discordant, filled with the pain of a dying world. The core resonance is failing, explained tone singer Vextal, her crystalline body dim and cracked with stress fractures. For generations, our planet's natural frequencies have sustained us, allowed us to reproduce, to build, to live. But the harmonics are degrading. Our children are born silent. Our cities crumble because they no longer sing with the planet's voice. David nodded thoughtfully, his human ears unable to detect the subtle frequency shifts that were killing an entire civilization. But his instruments recorded every nuance. He had been studying resonant biology and culture for 3 years, ever since first contact between their species. What if the problem isn't that your planet is losing its voice? David suggested gently, but that it's trying to sing a song it's forgotten? Vextel's crystalline form chimed with confusion. Explain. David activated a holographic display that showed the planet's internal structure. Your world is geologically active tectonic plates, magma currents, crystalline formations that grow and shift over time. But your civilization has been trying to maintain the exact same harmonic frequency for 10 millennia. You're fighting against your planet's natural evolution. The crystal matrix vibrated with what humans had learned to recognize as deep thought. You suggest we should allow our world to change? But change brings chaos, disorder, death. Change brings growth, David replied. On Earth, we learned to work with our planet's changes rather than against them. We built cities that could flex with earthquakes, developed agriculture that adapted to shifting seasons, created music that celebrated the unpredictability of natural rhythms. Over the following days, David worked alongside resonant engineers to develop something unprecedented, a harmonic amplification system that didn't force the planet to maintain artificial frequencies, but instead amplified and harmonized with its natural evolution. The results were miraculous. For the first time in centuries, young resonants were born singing. The planet's cities began to grow in organic patterns that flowed with geological currents rather than fighting them. 3 star systems away, on the gas giant nebula Tertius, human doctor Rachel Torres floated in a pressure suit through the cloud cities of the Drifter Collective. The Drifters were beings of living gas, their consciousness distributed through complex molecular arrangements that allowed them to exist as sentient clouds. But a plague was ravaging their population, toxic particles, introduced by industrial pollution that disrupted their molecular coherence. The contamination spreads faster than we can contain it, explained current writer Zephylos, his gaseous form barely maintaining cohesion as he spoke. Our purification methods cannot filter out these particles without also removing essential components of our being. We face extinction within decades. Rachel had spent months studying drifter physiology, learning how consciousness could exist as organized gas currents. Her solution was elegant in its simplicity. You're thinking like engineers, she told the assembled drifter healers, trying to remove the contamination mechanically. But what if we approach this biologically? She introduced modified Earth bacteria, Dodosaurus organisms adapted to thrive in the drifter's atmospheric conditions, and programmed to consume the specific toxic particles that were killing them. But more importantly, she showed the drifters how to cultivate and guide these bacteria, how to work with living systems rather than mechanical ones. On Earth, we learned that the best solutions often come from working with life rather than against it, Rachel explained as the first test subjects showed signs of recovery. Your bodies are ecosystems. Sometimes the answer isn't to remove the problem, but to introduce something that can transform the problem into something beneficial. The bacterial colonies not only consumed the toxic particles, but converted them into nutrients that actually enhanced drifter consciousness. For the first time in centuries, their thoughts became clearer. Their ability to maintain individual identity while sharing collective experiences grew stronger. But perhaps the most profound changes were happening in the spaces between official diplomatic missions. On the ancient archive world of eternal memory, human teacher Lisa Park sat in a circle with young beings from a dozen different species, playing a simple game that was revolutionizing galactic society. It's called hide and seek, Lisa explained to her attentive audience. Around her sat young resonants whose crystalline bodies sparkled with curiosity, gaseous drifter children who swirled in excited patterns, and even a few juvenile archive keepers being so ancient that their children were older than most civilizations. The archive keeper youngling, barely 1,000 years old, vibrated with confusion. But what is the purpose of this activity? Where is the educational value? The skill development? The contribution to cosmic order? Lisa smiled, remembering similar questions from her own species' youth. The purpose is joy. The value is in learning that not everything has to have a purpose beyond making you happy. What followed challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligent behavior that had governed galactic society for millennia. The young beings learned to play or to engage in activity that served no productive function, achieved no educational goals, and contributed nothing to their species' designated roles in cosmic order. They learned to laugh. The sound was revolutionary. For the first time in eons, the archive world echoed with spontaneous expressions of delight. Young creatures who had been raised to view existence as a series of cosmic responsibilities discovered that life could also be fun. The implications spread rapidly through galactic society. On worlds where children had been educated from birth to fulfill predetermined roles, human teachers introduced concepts like imagination, creativity, and play. Games that had no winners or losers. Stories that celebrated individual choice over collective duty. Songs that valued emotional expression over functional harmony. Back in the council chamber, reports were flooding in from every corner of galactic civilization. Ancient territorial disputes were being resolved not through superior force or diplomatic pressure, but through human mediation techniques that helped species remember why they had been fighting and whether those reasons still mattered. On the border worlds between the warlike Talon clans and the pacifist Garden worlds, human negotiator James Wright had achieved the impossible EOSER, a peace treaty based not on mutual deterrence, but on mutual benefit. The Talon clans discovered that their warrior culture could find purpose in protecting the Garden world's delicate ecosystems, while the Garden worlds learned that their agricultural techniques could help the Talon clans heal their war-torn homelands. "They're not conquering," whispered tone singer Kelnara, her crystalline form chiming with wonder as she processed reports from across the galaxy. "They're not even governing. They're just helping." High Chancellor Vexithara's mathematical form had stabilized, but its patterns were more complex now, incorporating variables that hadn't existed in galactic politics for millennia. "They make themselves indispensable," it observed, "but not through force or economic pressure. Through genuine utility." Dr. Alex Wang nodded from his position at the simple metal table. "Every species in this galaxy has been stagnant for thousands of years. You've achieved perfect order, perfect stability, perfect predictability, but perfection is another word for death." The displays around the chamber showed images that defied 40,000 years of galactic orthodoxy. Resonant crystals growing in patterns that had never existed before, shaped by collaboration with human architects. Drifter consciousness networks expanding beyond their traditional boundaries, enhanced by human understanding of biological systems. Archive keepers engaging in activities that served no archival function whatsoever. They were learning to dance. "You've forgotten," Maria Santos said quietly, her voice somehow carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "You've all forgotten the most important thing about being alive." "Which is?" asked Shard Echo Kelvana, her crystalline form now glowing with frequencies that hadn't been heard from her species in millennia. Maria's smile was gentle but transformative. "Being alive means growing, changing, becoming something you've never been before. You've spent so long maintaining perfect order that you've forgotten how to evolve." Around the chamber, ancient beings were experiencing something they hadn't felt in eons, curiosity about their own potential. The careful balance of galactic civilization wasn't collapsing, or it was transforming into something that none of them could predict, and High Chancellor Vexithara's mathematical form convulsed, its precise geometric patterns dissolving into chaotic swirls of light and calculation. Across the Galactic Council chamber, similar transformations were occurring as beings who had existed in perfect stasis for millennia suddenly experienced something they blee. Vexithara gasped, its voice fragmenting across multiple frequency ranges. "I am experiencing. The entity struggled with concepts it had not needed for 10,000 years. Curiosity, wonder, the desire to learn something I do not already know. The sensation was spreading like a contagion through the chamber. Shard Echo Kelvana's crystalline body began resonating at frequencies her species hadn't produced since their early evolutionary period. The harmonic patterns of discovery, of questions without predetermined answers. The archive keepers, being so ancient they remembered the birth of stars, started accessing memory files they had sealed away eons ago, files containing records of when their species had been young enough to dream. General Tom Rodriguez observed the transformation with the satisfaction of a strategist whose most complex operation was succeeding beyond expectations. Your species have evolved beyond biological necessity, he explained calmly. You've transcended hunger, reproduction, territorial conflict, survival pressure. You've achieved technological and social perfection. Dr. Alex Wang stood, his instruments recording unprecedented energy readings throughout the chamber. But perfection has a cost. When you no longer need to grow, you stop growing. When you no longer face challenges, you stop developing solutions. When you no longer encounter the unknown, you stop being able to imagine. The displays around the chamber shifted to show scenes from across the galaxy that would have been impossible just hours earlier, on worlds where no significant change had occurred for centuries. Revolutionary transformations were taking place. On the tidally locked planet Eternal Twilight, the shadow-dwelling Umbral Collective had spent millennia in perfect, unchanging darkness. Their society organized around the absolute predictability of their environment. But human artist Miguel Santos had introduced something unprecedented: portable light sources that could create temporary illuminated spaces. The result was chaos, a beautiful, generative chaos. For the first time in their recorded history, Umbral beings were experiencing variable light conditions. They discovered that their perception of reality was fundamentally altered by illumination levels. Art forms that had been static for millennia suddenly became dynamic. Social structures based on permanent shadow hierarchies began adapting to temporary light-based communities. They're learning to see, Dr. Wang explained as the chamber watched Umbral beings create their first-ever collaborative light sculptures. Not just visually, but conceptually. They're discovering that reality itself can be more variable than they believed possible. Similar revelations were occurring throughout galactic civilization. The mathematical entity that called itself Calculation Prime had achieved perfect logical consistency 3,000 years ago and had spent the intervening time simply existing in a state of absolute rational stability. But human philosopher Dr. Elena Martinez had posed a question that shattered its equilibrium. What if logic itself is incomplete? The resulting philosophical crisis had spread through the entire network of pure thought, forcing beings who had considered themselves beyond learning to confront the possibility that their perfect understanding was actually a perfectly limited understanding. This is what you've done to us, Vexithera said, its form now flickering between mathematical precision and something approaching organic chaos. You've introduced uncertainty into systems designed for absolute certainty. Maria Santos approached the center of the chamber, her simple human form somehow commanding the attention of beings whose existence spanned geological ages. Uncertainty isn't a flaw in the system, she said gently. Uncertainty is what makes growth possible. The displays shifted again, showing the most profound transformation of all. On worlds where young beings had been raised in perfect educational systems that prepared them for predetermined roles in cosmic order, something unprecedented was happening. Children were refusing their assignments. Young resonants who had been trained from birth to become harmonic engineers were instead choosing to become harmonic explorers, seeking to discover new frequency patterns rather than maintaining traditional ones. Juvenile archive keepers were abandoning their designated roles as memory preservers to become memory creators, recording new experiences rather than cataloging old ones. Most revolutionary of all, the young beings were playing together across species boundaries. Games that had never been invented because they served no functional purpose were emerging spontaneously. Stories were being created that had no educational value beyond the joy of imagination. Songs were being sung that celebrated individual experience rather than collective harmony. They're becoming individuals. Observe the collective prime of the hive networks, its distributed consciousness struggling to process the concept. Young beings who should be accepting their roles in our perfect unity are instead choosing their own paths. Because, said General Rodriguez, humans taught them that choosing your own path is not a betrayal of your species. It's the ultimate expression of what your species could become. The implications were staggering. For 40,000 years, Galactic civilization had operated on the principle that each species served a specific function in the cosmic order. The builders built. The thinkers thought. The harmonizers harmonized. The preservers preserved. Individual variation was minimized in favor of collective efficiency. But now, young beings across the galaxy were discovering that they could be more than their species' designated role. A young builder might also be a thinker. A harmonizer might also be an explorer. A preserver might also be a creator. "This is anarchy," protested Shard Echo Kelvana, though her crystalline form was singing frequencies of excitement that contradicted her words. "If beings can choose any role, how do we maintain cosmic order?" Dr. Wang smiled, his expression carrying the patience of a teacher explaining a simple concept to brilliant students who had somehow never encountered it before. "You don't maintain order. You allow order to emerge from the choices beings make when they're free to become their best selves." The chamber filled with something that hadn't been heard in millennia. Genuine laughter. It came from the young archive keeper who had learned to play hide-and-seek, whose 1,000-year-old consciousness had just discovered the concept of surprise. The sound was infectious, spreading to beings who had forgotten that joy was possible. "We have been sleeping," whispered the collective voice of the archive keepers, beings whose memories spanned geological ages. "For eons, we have been maintaining perfect preservation of knowledge, perfect cataloging of experience, perfect stagnation." Their distributed consciousness accessed memory files that had been sealed for millions of years, records of when their species had been young, curious, eager to learn rather than simply to remember. They found archives of questions without answers, of experiments without predetermined results, of art created for the simple joy of creation. "We remember," they continued, their ancient voices carrying harmonics of rediscovered wonder. "We remember when we did not know everything, when we still had dreams of becoming something we had never been before." The transformation was accelerating. Across the galaxy, species that had existed in perfect stability for millennia were rediscovering the capacity for change, not chaotic, destructive change, but the directed evolution that comes from beings who dare to imagine better versions of themselves. Maria stepped forward, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber and every connected world beyond. "This is why the galaxy declared war on humanity. Not because we were aggressive, but because we represented something you had forgotten was possible." She gestured toward the display showing young beings from 100 different species playing together, learning together, dreaming together. "We represented the future. Not the preservation of what you've always been, but the possibility of becoming something none of us has ever imagined." High Chancellor Vexithera's form had stabilized, but it was no longer the rigid mathematical precision that had defined it for millennia. Its patterns now included variables for uncertainty, creativity, growth, concepts that would have been errors in its previous configuration, but were now integral to its function. "What happens now?" it asked. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the question was genuine. The Chancellor truly did not know the answer. Maria's smile contained the warmth of a species that had always believed the best questions were the ones nobody could answer yet. "Now," she said, "we find out together." The awakening of the archive keepers sent shockwaves through galactic civilization that dwarfed even the appearance of humanity's impossible fleet. These beings, older than most stars, had served as the galaxy's living memory for eons, or repositories of knowledge so vast and ancient that entire civilizations had risen and fallen in the time it took them to process a single complete thought. But now they were remembering dreams, we recall. Their collective voice resonated through quantum communication, networks spanning the galaxy. When this cosmos was young and every species reached beyond the boundaries of their understanding. We remember when the resonance first learned to sing matter itself into new configurations. When the drifters discovered consciousness could exist as organized energy. When the builders realized that creation itself was the highest form of art. In the council chamber, the transformation was accelerating beyond anything the assembled representatives had ever witnessed. High Chancellor Vexthera's mathematical form had evolved into something unprecedented. A geometric pattern that included variables for concepts like hope, wonder, and the radical notion that the future might be fundamentally different from the past. "You have infected us," Vexthera said, but its tone carried no accusation, only amazement. You have introduced chaos into systems designed for perfect order. You have contaminated our certainty with life. Maria Santos finished gently. You've been maintaining such perfect stability that you forgot the difference between existence and living. The displays around the chamber now showed the full scope of the transformation sweeping across galactic civilization, on worlds that had remained unchanged for millennia. Impossible things were happening. The rigid caste system of the builder worlds, where beings had been locked into hereditary construction roles for 50,000 years, was dissolving as young builders chose to become architects, designers, even artists. For the first time in recorded history, builder settlements were being designed for beauty rather than just functionality. The eternal contemplation chambers of the thinker collectives, where beings had spent centuries in motionless meditation on cosmic truths, were filling with debates, discussions, and something unprecedented, arguments based on opinion rather than logic. Thinkers were discovering that not all questions had objective answers, and that subjective experience might be just as valid as universal law. Most remarkably, the carefully maintained territorial boundaries that had defined galactic politics for eons were becoming meaningless. Species were abandoning ancient border controls not through conquest, but through cooperation. The age-old trade restrictions, the millennia-old diplomatic protocols, the carefully balanced power structures that had maintained cosmic order, all of it crumbling as beings discovered the joy of voluntary collaboration. General Tom Rodriguez addressed the chamber with the satisfaction of a military strategist whose greatest victory had been achieved without firing a shot. You wanted to declare war on humanity to preserve your order. Instead, we're helping you fight a different war against stagnation, against fear, against the slow death of wonder. Dr. Alex Wang stepped forward, his instruments recording energy signatures that had never been detected before. Ancient beings were generating new types of consciousness, new forms of awareness that emerged from the combination of perfect knowledge and rediscovered curiosity. The war you declared was based on a fundamental misunderstanding, Dr. Wang explained. You saw humanity's refusal to accept designated roles as a threat to cosmic stability. But stability without growth isn't ordery, it's entropy. The screens shifted to show the most profound change of all. Throughout the galaxy, children of different species were not just playing together. They were becoming something entirely new. Young resonants who learned human concepts of rhythm were creating crystal formations that sang in ways their species had never imagined. Juvenile drifters who understood human notions of individual identity were maintaining personal consciousness while still participating in collective awareness. They're evolving, whispered Collective Prime, its hive consciousness struggling to process the concept of unity that didn't require conformity. Our young are becoming something that none of our species have ever been before. Maria approached the center of the chamber, her simple human presence somehow commanding the attention of beings whose existence spanned geological ages. The small black device on the table dissolved out, revealing that it had never been technology at all. Just a simple wooden toy block carved by human hands. Sometimes, she said, holding up the block, the most advanced solution is also the simplest. We didn't bring you superior weapons or advanced technology. We brought you something you had forgotten existed. She placed the wooden block on the crystalline surface of the chamber floor, where it looked absurdly primitive against the backdrop of cosmic grandeur. But around that simple carved toy, representatives of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy gathered like children drawn to a new game. We brought you the capacity to imagine, Maria continued, to wonder what might be possible if you stopped insisting that the future must be identical to the past. High Chancellor Vex Tharanelto in action. That would have been impossible in its previous rigid mathematical configuration, and touched the wooden block with a geometric appendage that had never before made contact with organic matter. This is what we lost, it said quietly. The ability to be surprised by simple things. The capacity to find wonder in the familiar made strange. The final transformation was visible throughout the chamber and across the galaxy. The Great Council Chamber, once a sterile monument to cosmic order, filled with something that hadn't been heard in a million years. The spontaneous laughter of ancient beings discovering joy again. Shard echo, Kelvana's crystalline form rang with frequencies that created new harmonic patterns in the chamber's acoustic structure. The archive keepers accessed memory files they had sealed away eons ago, files containing records of when knowledge was something to be discovered rather than just preserved. The collective entities found themselves experiencing the unprecedented sensation of individual thoughts arising within group consciousness. The galaxy declared war on humanity, Vexithera said, its transformed voice carrying harmonics of wonder that would have been impossible in its previous configuration, but humanity has ensured it truly is the last war. How? Asked Shardeko Kelvana, her resonance patterns now including frequencies of curiosity that her species hadn't produced for millennia. Maria's smile contained the wisdom of a species that had always understood the most profound truth about existence. By teaching you that the only enemy worth fighting is your own fear of becoming something more than you've ever been before. The displays around the chamber showed the final scenes of humanity's gentle revolution. Across the galaxy, species were discovering that growth and change weren't threats to their identity. They were the fulfillment of their deepest potential. The careful balance of cosmic order wasn't collapsing. It was evolving into something that no one could predict but everyone wanted to explore. Dr. Wang delivered the final revelation as ancient beings throughout the chamber experienced emotions they had forgotten were possible. This is why we named ourselves human. In our oldest languages, it meant both of the earth and humble. We knew we weren't the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced. But we never stopped asking the most important question in the universe, which is, asked the collective voice of the archive keepers, though they were already beginning to remember the answer themselves. General Rodriguez spoke for his species with quiet pride. What comes next? The Great Council Chamber, once a monument to eternal stability, now echoed with the sound of a galaxy taking its first steps into a future none of them could predict, and all of them wanted to create together. The last war was over, not because one side had conquered the other, but because both sides had discovered they could become something neither had ever imagined being. In the end, humanity's greatest weapon hadn't been their impossible ships or their alliance with ancient void creatures. It had been their unshakable belief that no matter how perfect something seemed, it could always become more perfect through the simple act of daring to change. The galaxy was learning to dream again, and the dreams were beautiful beyond measure. For the first time in a million years, no one knew what would happen tomorrow, and everyone was excited to find out.